Hands up.
Good morning. I'm Daniel Blaikie, the Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona and the NDP's Democratic Reform critic. The Prime Minister enjoys a lot of power in the Canadian system of government, but perhaps one of the most important powers that the Prime Minister has is the ability to dissolve or prorogue Parliament at will. What that means is the Prime Minister can call an election at any time that he wants, and at any point, if he's not happy with what's going on in Parliament, he can tear up all that work, stop Parliament with a prorogation, and have parliamentarians have to start back from scratch. This is something that I don't think makes a lot of sense in a 21st century democracy, because Parliament is the body that's supposed to hold the government to account. It makes no sense to allow the head of the government all of this power to decide when that body will meet and on what terms and conditions. And in countries that also have Westminster systems like ours, we've seen in the UK, for example, some limits put on the Prime Minister's power to do this, requiring a vote in the House of Commons. So these are important powers of the Prime Minister. They're the kinds of powers some might refer to as gatekeeping powers. And that's why I presented a motion to give the House of Commons a bigger say on when the House of Commons meets, whether the House of Commons will dissolve for an election, whether the work of the House of Commons will be brought to a close by some kind of prorogation. And in the first hour of debate on Friday, there were a couple of surprises. I was glad to see the Bloc Québécois declare support for the motion. I was surprised to see the Liberals not have a position yet. And I was especially surprised at the Conservatives. The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, spends a lot of time attacking the Prime Minister and attacking the gatekeeping powers of the Prime Minister. This is a clear opportunity for Pierre Poilievre to put limits on the power of the Prime Minister to do these things, to put limits on the power of the Prime Minister to shut down Parliament. And Pierre Poilievre seems to have blinked for reasons not readily apparent. And I think this is consistent with a theme when it comes to Pierre Poilievre and his talk about gatekeeping. Consider, for instance, that he likes to talk about gatekeeping in housing, but he really only talks about public gatekeeping in the housing market. When it comes to private sector gatekeepers, he's silent. Big corporate landlords that are buying up affordable units, rent-evicting the tenants, jacking up rents, or selling them as condos, those folks are gatekeeping access to housing just as much as any elected public official. But Pierre Poilievre has nothing to say about those people, and he has no real solutions to ensure that that gatekeeping doesn't get in the way of Canadians having an affordable home. Pierre Poilievre likes to talk about gatekeepers when it comes to inflation, but he refuses to talk about the role that private companies like Loblaws and others have played in jacking up the prices for Canadians to get access to one of the most important things, food. Why is it that Pierre Poilievre has nothing to say about people who are gatekeeping access to food by setting unreasonably high prices? When we think about access to prescription drugs and medication, Pierre Poilievre, again, likes to talk about gatekeepers, but he's got nothing to say about the big pharmaceutical companies that are responsible for Canadians paying the third highest rates in the world for prescription drugs. What does Pierre Poilievre have to say about that? Nothing at all, except maybe that we should join a class action lawsuit against promoters of OxyContin. And while he's not wrong to say that Canada should do that, that's something New Democrats have been calling for a long time. When it comes to the single most thing that would attack the gatekeeping power of pharmaceutical companies, a national pharmacare plan that would mobilize the power of bulk purchasing and ensure that every Canadian got access to prescription drugs, he votes against it. He doesn't just not say anything about it, he actively attacks it. And now he's got a clear opportunity to go after the gatekeeping powers of the Prime Minister, and where is he? Nowhere. Nowhere to be seen. He's chosen to blink instead of putting some meaningful constraints on this otherwise unfettered power of the Prime Minister. And I'll tell you, it's one thing to criticize gatekeepers. I think the appropriate response is to look at things like my motion to put some constraints, some democratic constraints on the power of the Prime Minister. It's important to engage ideas like pharmacare in order to put some real constraints on the gatekeeping powers of pharmaceutical companies. But I say to Canadians, beware the man who criticizes gatekeepers but has no solutions to limit their power and asks only that you give those powers to him. That's a person to watch out for, because he's not serious about attacking the problem of gatekeeping. He's just trying to become the principal gatekeeper himself. And I think that's the lesson that we're learning through this motion. The good news is that it's not too late. It's not too late for Pierre Poilievre to change his mind. It's not too late for Pierre Poilievre to work with New Democrats to put meaningful democratic controls on the unfettered power of the Prime Minister. I invite him and his caucus to join with me to pass motion M-79 and make it much harder for Prime Ministers in the future, including this Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in the future, to abuse the powers of prorogation and dissolution. So thank you very much for taking some time this morning to listen, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail. Mr. Blaikie, can you give us an example of an abuse of the powers of prorogation and dissolution that this would, in theory at least, prevent?
Sure, I'll give you two. So we saw in the summer of 2020, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decided to prorogue Parliament. It was a controversial prorogation because it happened right around the time that parliamentary committees were bringing to light all sorts of details about the We Charity scandal. That prorogation was coincided with the resignation of the finance minister, something that I think parliamentarians would have had a lot of questions to ask at the time. And the effect of that prorogation was to end a lot of committee investigations into the We Charity scandal, meaning that when Parliament resumed, all of that had to start up from nothing again instead of being able to continue on in that work. I think the most important example of the abuse of prorogation goes back to 2008, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper knew very well that he was facing a confidence vote on the floor of the House of Commons within a matter of days. And rather than do the honorable thing and meet Parliament to have confidence in his government tested, he decided instead to go to the Governor General and have a prorogation in order to stop opposition parties from judging his government on a confidence motion. And of course, as we know, time passes quickly in politics. Weeks feel like months and months feel like years. So he had a cooling off period. The leadership of the Liberal Party changed in the meantime. And I think, you know, ultimately we had a very different outcome when there finally was an opportunity to test the confidence of the House than there would have been in that December. And I think that's the clearest example of a Prime Minister abusing their power in order to manipulate the political system.
Is it really serious to see that as a problem for the Canadian public when a couple of months passed and the coalition that had claimed to be able to provide a stable government to Canada wasn't able to push forward a vote of confidence or non-confidence against the Prime Minister? In other words, a couple of months passed and apparently this coalition had dissolved, so clearly it was not the stable government that they promised to be. So in other words, if you can't hold it together for a couple of months of prorogation, what's the big problem for Canadians?
Well, I mean, we can do a deep dive into the hypothetical here. I think for those who were concerned about outcomes of the Harper government, which persisted because of that prorogation, I think Canadians should be concerned. You know, anyone who thought that the privatization of the Canadian Wheat Board was a problem, arguably, that goes back to that prorogation. And the fact that in the context that obtained, that Prime Minister Harper created with that prorogation, the Liberal Party couldn't hold their leadership together or didn't want to hold their leadership together, isn't to say that had things played out differently and a coalition government were put in place, that Stéphane Dion's leadership would have been challenged in the same way. So it's hard to say. One of the unfortunate things about politics is that you can't recreate the conditions of the past to test different possible futures. But I will say this, which is that too often we end up talking about this question of confidence and prorogation in the middle of a crisis, right? It's the worst time to figure out the best way to resolve those problems. And those problems really do have consequences for Canadians because they decide who the most powerful person in the country is. If you think that the Prime Minister is the most powerful person, certainly one of the most powerful people. So that does have downstream consequences for Canadians because it decides important questions of public policy, like whether we have a pharmacare program in order to get people better and cheaper access to prescription drugs, or whether we have a sensible housing policy that's actually going to cause affordable units to be built that Canadians can access, or whether we have a government that's willing to take on inappropriate price increases during a period of inflation and economic trouble, as we've seen with grocery prices over the last year or so. So I know it sounds kind of academic, but the consequences for Canadians are not academic at all. They're very real.
I want to ask about what you're calling for in the context of your deal with the Liberals. You're trying, in essence, to take away some power from the government. This is the government that you're essentially propping up, but at the same time, confidence votes give your party a degree of relevance, a power of leverage in this deal. Can you walk me through that a little bit? Are you trying to take away some of that leverage from your own party?
I'm happy to walk you through it. So, I mean, this motion is actually very like a motion that I tabled in the last Parliament. So it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. In fact, I've been thinking about it since 2008 when I was a graduate student. And I remember I had a paper due, and instead of working on my paper, I was kind of listening to the radio with bated breath during that very long meeting between Stephen Harper and then Governor General Michaël Jean. So it's something I've been thinking about for a very long time. It's something that I tabled a proposal for in the last Parliament. And for me, whether it's the confidence supply agreement or whether it's just the fact of minority government, this is the 5th minority parliament that we've had in the 21st century in Canada. They're more the norm, actually, than majority government at this point. It's about just trying to clarify what the rules of engagement are. And I think that's helpful whether you're operating under a confidence and supply agreement or not. I think Canadians deserve to know and parliamentarians deserve to know when a vote is happening. Is it a confidence vote or not? Right now, you need to call in a bunch of constitutional experts and PhDs in order to figure out what's a confidence vote and what's not a confidence vote, or who's acting appropriately in the context of a parliamentary crisis or not. I think this should be a lot more clear and simple. I think it can be more clear and simple. I think it's a choice to continue to leave it to the kind of moment-to-moment public deliberations instead of writing it down. And it's not to say that that's going to solve all the problems or that we're not going to have any more political conflict in Canada, but it does mean that we're going to have a lot clearer guidelines for how to sort it out when it gets complicated, as it often does. We even saw, wasn't that long ago, a few months ago, there was some musing in the media about whether an opposition day motion would be a confidence vote or not. We should know whether these things are votes of confidence or not. It shouldn't be a question of speculation. It should be a question of consulting the rule and knowing whether it's a confidence vote or not. So my hope is to bring a little more clarity to that, and by doing that, make it more difficult for prime ministers to abuse what right now is a pretty broad and undefined set of powers that are very open to abuse, and we've seen examples of that, whether it's the summer of 2020 or the prorogation of 2008.
So for you, it's just about clarity. It's not about reducing the potential for confidence votes and sanctioning the government if they were to go that route.
Well, I do think in order to get clarity, you need to have rules, and that involves accountability. So I do want to see it more clear, like which votes are confidence votes, and that's what I'm trying to do in the context of the motion. I think that's important. So yes, I do think that the Prime Minister's power in this regard needs to be limited. I find it unfortunate that in Canada, in order to do what I think would be the gold standard, which is actually submit these things to votes in the House of Commons, you would need a constitutional amendment. So what I've tried to do by addressing the question of confidence and prorogation at the same time is to say if a Prime Minister wants to prorogue in a way that most parliamentarians find offensive, he can either have a confidence vote before he prorogues, which I would see as getting permission effectively from Parliament to do that. Otherwise, the first matter of business when we come back will be a confidence vote, not a speech from the throne. And that gives the House of Commons more ability to frame prorogation and to tell the story of a prorogation, and also creates a moment of accountability for the Prime Minister that I think is long overdue.
I think you know that some people will say that the New Democrats have given the Prime Minister additional power to avoid confidence votes by entering into a confidence and supply arrangement, which some people argue gives the government a blank check for a period of time to govern as it will without facing regular confidence votes in the House of Commons. Do you see no sort of irony that you want to restrict or constrain and review the Prime Minister's power to dissolve Parliament when in fact people would say the NDP is constraining Parliament's power to sanction the Prime Minister?
People say many things. I would politely disagree with those who say that. I don't see any irony in it at all. We haven't given a blank check to the Prime Minister. What we've said is that if the Prime Minister wants to continue to govern, he'll implement a national dental care program. He'll provide a rental benefit to Canadians.
Taking away the threat of confidence votes that could bring down the government on a regular basis.
No more so than when the Prime Minister has a majority, and in fact less so, because we're requiring the Prime Minister to do things for people as a condition of staying in power. We're requiring him to institute a national dental program. We're requiring him to take action on affordable housing and on climate change. There are 27 things that we're requiring this government to do between when the agreement was signed and 2025, and we have reserved the right entirely to withdraw our support from the government if they don't meet the objectives and the timelines in the confidence and supply agreement. And I think that as long as we're going to have minority parliaments of some kind or other, whether there's confidence and supply agreements or not, Canadians will be better served by having more clarity about what the rules around confidence and prorogation are. And as I say, the worst time to try and sort that out is in the middle of a crisis. So I'm glad that my motion has come up in the lottery, as is the want of private members' business, at a time where we don't have a hot crisis about the Prime Minister and about the government and about a confidence vote. I think this is exactly the time for a real conversation about it. And it is the time for Conservatives who are concerned about the Prime Minister having too much power to join with New Democrats and actually do something about it by putting more power in the House of Commons that's democratically elected than currently is the case in respect of these matters.
You repeatedly used the phrase gatekeepers, which you know very well is Pierre Poilievre's favorite phrase. So you're targeting this at him. And you didn't stick, by the way, in your press conference to speaking about your motion. You made it a general, I think 4-minute long statement about Pierre Poilievre. Is there a reason for that?
Well, because I think he spends a lot of time talking about how gatekeepers are doing harm to Canadians, but he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about how we constrain the power that those gatekeepers have.
Sounds like you've got to think about Pierre Poilievre, though. Are you worried about him?
I'm very aware of Pierre Poilievre. What I would like is for him to be a little bit more honest with Canadians about what he's trying to do, because I think he's trying to take those gatekeeping powers for himself rather than to do the right thing and place democratic controls over those powers so that Canadians get more say. And so, yeah, I am paying attention to Pierre Poilievre. I'm listening to what he says. I'm listening to what he tells Canadians. And I'm here to tell Canadians that I don't think they're getting the full bill of goods from this guy, and that he should be more interested in solutions than he is about the attacks.
Have you had any direct conversations with the Conservatives about this motion in particular, trying to get them on side?
Well, I've invited them into that conversation. I held a briefing for all parliamentarians. We did have some Conservative MPs in attendance. So, and I've reached out to some privately to talk about these issues as well. So I'm definitely in conversation with them and open to more conversation. As I said earlier, it's not too late for Conservatives to change their mind about this motion. I hope that they do. I'm looking forward to seeing it pass above all. And so if we can have those conversations and get to a place where they're prepared to support it with the support of the Bloc, it would be enough. And we could actually, in this Parliament, take meaningful action to limit the powers of Justin Trudeau and future Prime Ministers. So that's something I would expect Conservatives to be excited about. So far, they aren't. You know, I would point to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in the last Parliament. We did a big, long study of Justin Trudeau's 2020 prorogation. One of the things I found very disappointing was that a majority of committee members couldn't get it together to recommend limiting the Prime Minister's powers of prorogation. That was something I thought was an important conclusion out of the study. If you read my supplementary report to that study, you'll find I'm very clear about that. I think I entitled the report Tweedledee and Tweedledum, how the Liberals and Conservatives conspire to protect the prerogative of the Crown. So we had some very interesting conversations around that table. And for me, this is an outgrowth of that, which is to say, okay, it's one thing to complain about how the PM abuses these powers. It's another thing to do something about it. And I think it's high time we did something about it instead of just complaining about it.
Sorry to belabor the technical here, but would this motion do anything about it? It's traditionally considered to be a reserved power of the Crown that is not subject to parliamentary restriction in Canada, and you know, we have a written constitution now, and motions tend not to bind the executive on things like that.
Yeah, well, I think, so the first thing to know is that if this motion passes, it changes the standing orders of the House of Commons, and that is binding. So this would be the House of Commons asserting its own authority. There is a constitutional limit to what we can assert as the House of Commons. But what it will do, I think, especially in relation to prorogation, is it will mean that either we have a confidence vote before a prorogation or we have a confidence vote immediately after prorogation. And I think that makes it politically a lot more difficult for a prime minister to exercise that power without accountability.
How could Parliament hold a confidence vote after a prorogation? You mean when the Parliament is...
When it comes back, it'll be the first order of business as compelled by the standing orders. So right now it's the standing orders that say we meet, in a first parliament, you elect a speaker, but if you're coming back for a second session, you go straight into a speech from the throne. That would no longer be the case. Instead, you would go right into a debate about confidence in the government and have a confidence vote. After that, you would have a speech from the throne. So I think that makes it a lot more politically challenging for a prime minister to abuse this power to change the channel, as we've seen them do in the past. And so, as I say, it's not the gold standard solution. I would like to go further, but I'm going as far as you can, and I have that on good authority from lawyers here on Parliament Hill, as well as constitutional experts off of Parliament Hill, that this motion pushes the authority of the House of Commons right to the constitutional limit.
All right, just a reminder for people online to state your name and organization, and we will take a question from Rachel. You have the floor.
Hi, thank you. Can you just clarify the timeline for this? You've had this first hour of debate on Friday. When is this next going to be back before the House, and how long could it be before it's actually voted on?
Thank you. So the second hour debate has not yet been scheduled. I think there is a good chance that we could have the second hour debate and the vote before we rise at the end of June. But if that doesn't happen, then it would be sometime early in the fall that we see second hour debate and then the vote shortly after.
And just touching on some of what you were mentioning there about your work on proc, usually changes to the standing orders are either done on consensus or at least it, is studied by the committee in some degree. Can you just speak to your decision to kind of move this ahead through a motion that presumably would, have that not be the kind of series of events that take place?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I think, this has been a long-standing issue. I'm an action-oriented person, and I like to see us actually do something about this. I know that a lot of good ideas go to proc to die, and so I'd like parliamentarians to take this seriously. And I think they'll take it more seriously in terms of contemplating the merits of the proposal by having it be something that could actually happen now instead of just a vote to send something off to committee. The second thing is that the Procedure and House Affairs Committee has been extraordinarily busy with a number of important issues in this Parliament. Beyond the kind of rote issue of boundary redistribution, which happens to be taking place right now, they've been studying the question of foreign interference, and now they've had a very important matter of privilege referred to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, which by convention takes precedence over all other matters, and that's the question of privilege raised by Mr. Chong in respect of the government failing to notify him that his family had been threatened as a result of a vote in the House of Commons. So there's a lot before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. I think it's unlikely that something like this would be prioritized, given that they have a matter of privilege before them and other important issues. And so this is something I think parliamentarians can study the merits of and have a vote on. I'm quite comfortable with that. I know we have done changes to the standing orders I've seen, for instance, around the estimates process. In the 42nd Parliament, for instance. And even though there had been some talk about those changes beforehand, it didn't mean that there wasn't any controversy or lessons learned once those changes to the standing orders had been made. So, and we just saw a whole bunch of changes to the standing orders be made around hybrid parliament, for instance, in the context of the pandemic. There was study of that afterward, but not a heck of a lot before. And so, Parliament is an interesting place, and there are different ways to do democracy. I think I've got a good proposal here we could go forward with. If parliamentarians in the future think that it's not working out the way it was intended, or that it could be improved upon, it will be up to them to decide if they'd like to change it or not. But I don't see any good reason not to move ahead to make things harder for the Prime Minister to abuse these powers, particularly when we continue to be in minority parliaments and the question of confidence and prorogation continues to come up as a matter of controversy.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.